Welcome to LaunchPod, a podcast made by entrepreneurs for entrepreneurs. At Next, we're on a mission to build a more ambitious, prosperous, and competitive Canada to shine a light on all of the bold entrepreneurs working to advance our ecosystem. So join us as we talk to those on the front lines as they share their stories of grit, determination, failure, and success. Picking up where we left off with episode 1, Next Canada alum Daniel Rodic, co-founder and CEO of Exact Media, will continue his conversation with his former professor and Next Canada's founder, Reza Satchu. Reza has successfully co-founded, built, managed, and sold 3 companies and is currently managing partner of Alignvest. He'll share his insights on fundraising, why being liked is the kiss of death, and what it took to build Canada's first accelerator. So, let's begin.
Thanks for taking the time to chat. So let's jump into your 4 main businesses amongst all the other things you've done.
Right.
And I thought, as we're discussing over email before, I think there's an interesting way to break it down. The first part I'd like to talk about is how you view spotting opportunities. The supplier market is interesting, but the one actually I was very interested to jump to was KGS.
Right.
Because in kind of the notes, you said one of the things you identified was this underpriced talent.
Right.
And that's probably one of the first times I've seen a business that I'm aware of that built on this thesis. And so
I've been fortunate in that I've been involved with 4 businesses, supplier market, storage now, KGS, and now Alignvest. Supplier market, I started with my brother, and we sold for close to $1 billion. Storage now, we sold for $120 million. KGS, we sold for almost $500 million. And then Alignvest, I'm now building. And so I think that there are certain learnings from all of them, and I'll share those in a minute, but let me answer your question specifically around KGS. KGS was an interesting business for me because the way in which that occurred, the business is a fixed income broker-dealer that effectively took advantage of the collapse of the financial crisis to hire a bunch of talent, as you said, that was mispriced and undervalued at that point in time. So we went from a scenario 2 years ago, 2 years prior to founding KGS, there would have been no chance of us creating KGS because we would have had to hire all these people with guaranteed contracts. These are, our initial group of people are people from Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, et cetera. And so after the financial crisis, suddenly there was this moment where people were really scared. And so we could hire really talented people with agreements that were much more friendly, much more viable for a startup. But what was interesting about KGS was I'm not a fixed income specialist, but what I realized was in the middle of the financial crisis was that, I remember Buffett says, be most greedy when the most people are fearful. It felt like there was an opportunity to do something in fixed income because that was the market that was getting hit the hardest in the financial crisis. But I didn't have the tools or the experience to figure out where to go in that space. But I knew that it couldn't be as bad as everyone was saying. And so the smartest person I knew in fixed income was a guy named Levent Karaman. He's the K. And Levent actually sat beside me in Harvard Business School. And I always said to him, you and I one day will build a business. And he then went to work at Salomon Brothers and then at Barclays, where he built a variety of fixed income prop desks. And so I called Levent and I said, listen, there's obviously this crazy world we're living in right now. I don't know what we should do, but I do know that you're the person I want to do it with. And we can figure something out together. And so I said, why don't you come down this weekend and we'll figure it out. And it actually ended up coming down for the whole week. And the business started at KS because the G wasn't there at that point in time. But the fundamental thesis around it was that we could go attract talent at a very different level than we would have otherwise and fill a gap in the market. And while the market was so discombobulated, we could build a franchise that would serve clients that were not being served at this point in time. One of the things that we did get wrong at KGS was that we thought that raising capital for this business would be much easier. I mean, both because, and perhaps some arrogance on my part, I felt like I'd built a couple of successful businesses at this point in time. I was partnering with someone who I'd known for a long period of time and who was clearly top of their field. And frankly, we could tell a very compelling story for why a business like this would exist. And it was because of the crisis that it was so compelling. But what we found was that, let me tell you what happened. What happened was we went zero for 240. Like literally, and Levent had left a job where he was making millions of dollars a year. And I thought I could deliver the capital. And what happened was it was even worse than going zero for 200 and whatever, because of course everyone liked us. And so they would it was like excruciating. We'd meet 10 times and then get turned down. Okay. This is one of the key things about fundraising is you actually want people to either hate you or love you. Okay. You want it to be binary. Like is the kiss of death, because what like is just a waste of time and you're not getting what you need. And so our problem was everyone thought we were really smart and that our proposition was really good, but they were scared. And what you learn, and this is a depressing thought about investors, is the single most important thing that they're looking for is who else is invested. And it's actually a ridiculous thought, but I think it's actually true. They'll talk about business model and team, and all those things are important. But until you have some scarcity around the investment side, people are going to stay on the sidelines, especially at a time when you think people should most want to dive in, which is at low valuations. But of course, that's when there's the most fear, right? Which is, well, we're in the middle of a crisis. I could get fired by making this decision. But, they'd much rather, and I turn to them and say, you realize this opportunity would have been exponentially more expensive 18 months ago, and you would have done that deal, right? You would have done that deal. And of course, they would have done that deal because they would have safety in numbers, they have cover, all these sorts of things. And so it was an interesting process, and we had to revamp how we went about raising capital. But I suppose the most important thing we learned there was at this point we brought on Dan Goldman, so it was KGS. So the three of us was that the only reason KGS succeeded ultimately is because of the strength of that partnership, right? Meaning there were so many blows that we had in that first year that had the three of us not had a tremendous commitment to each other and ultimately conviction around the business, it would have failed. We wouldn't have had the tenacity and the persistence to make something happen. With KGS, I think initially the key learnings for me were the importance of partnership, and resilience around a partnership and alignment. And then thirdly, that KGS was probably the best idea that we had, the most novel idea at a time that made the most sense. But because it was a fearful time, when people should most want to invest, it was very hard to get people to cross the finish line.
Is there anything you've learned in let's focus on just raising money and investment? You just touched on either I want you to love me or hate me. How have you approached that since?
Let's just take a step back. Here's what I'd say about fundraising. So I think as a new entrepreneur, the most important thing around fundraising, this is obviously you've got to have a business that is that you believe in, passion and all these sorts of things. But if we just stick to fundraising, I think a truism is that as a new entrepreneur, you better have the people that know you best, that you have worked with, even for a short period of time, be initial backers of your venture. They better invest in you. But one, because they know you best, and two, because ultimately these are the folks that, it doesn't have to be a large amount of money, but they presumably like and trust you, and they think that you can make some money. Certainly for my businesses in the supplier market, I would say that every material relationship of mine and my brothers, even though we'd only worked for a few years, invested in supplier market. And what that does is it just sends a signal to other investors that, okay, well, at least these guys aren't thieves, or they're guys that people that they've worked with trust. I'd say even in KGS and certainly in Alignvest, the key initial group were just people who knew me well. And what that does is it just builds some level of credibility. It's not the panacea. It doesn't get you home, but it builds some level of credibility. I think the second piece to your question around how do you get from like to love/hate is you have to build some sense of scarcity and urgency, right? So from an investor's perspective, they almost invariably would like to have more time, more information, and wait until the last minute to actually make a commitment, right? From an entrepreneur's perspective, time is not your friend, right? You want to get moving and so you've got to create scarcity around your offering. And that scarcity can either be because you've got other alternatives, meaning you don't actually need the capital, or you've got other capital that you think is going to come in. And this is the chicken or egg problem. But I will tell you that having options is the key to actually settling on, to actually getting your raise done.
Tactically, though, how do you do that in a credible way? Because you can imagine, let's say you're talking to 10 investors and you're telling each one is well, I have this other 9,
right,
but you really have nothing.
So here's what I'd say is that what you can't do is mislead people, right? Because the kiss of death for raising money is if people think that you lack integrity, all right? So I think this is a very fine line, but I want to be very clear that there's a difference between creating scarcity and telling people things that aren't true. And so what I'd say is in each one of my businesses, I've had to try to walk that line, right? And it's not an easy line to walk, knowing that if I slip over to the side of sort of gray, it's game over. I think it's pretty critical for an investor to be able to trust you. I think it is how you speak about your alternatives and what level of conviction you have and the process you're in and who you're talking to. And it's less about, misleading people. It's more about just they leave thinking, okay, this is someone who's going to make something happen. You're not telling them that it's happening with X, Y, or Z, but you're giving them a feeling that it's going to happen and that they're not the most important way in which it's going to happen, meaning it's happening with or without them, right? And so I think it is a subtle way of getting to the same point, which is the other party thinking, well, this is something I could miss out on. And even at KGS, that was the model we had, was this is happening. We have great conviction in it, and we have enough relationships, enough swings of bat here that it's going to work.
I think this tactic is also interesting, and then we can jump to next stuff, but it's in selling your business. And so whether you want to talk to Storage Now or Supplier Market or something else, both of those scenarios are one where there was really, there's one buyer.
And KGS. So all three of those businesses, ultimately, there was just one buyer. But here's the thing about a sale is you just need one. Okay, now ideally you want that one to think that there are many. So it's a similar thing where it's critical that people think you have alternatives, but at the same time, you can't make them up. So Supplier Market, we took that confidence level to a different level in that what we'd filed to go public. We had filed our S1 to go public. And so we had a credible alternative. Now, what I would say is my brother, John Bergson, and I were the three co-founders of the business. We had a view that we were pricing at a crazy level. Like CS was our lead banker. We were going to go public at $3, $4, $5 billion. And the difference to us, frankly, we had no money. And so whether it was $1 billion or $5 billion was somewhat irrelevant to us. What we were much more concerned about is we were going to price this thing. Everyone else was going to get out. We were never going to get out. But we had a credible alternative. We just went and saw these people and said, okay, for $1 billion, you can take us out, or we're going public, right? Now, that's a credible alternative, right? And one bet, Ariba bet, and we made it happen. Right. And then on Storage Now, the same thing where we knew there was a big opportunity in self-storage. We started building it. It was with our own money. And ultimately, we decided to sell the business. There was one buyer. And the way we went to that buyer was not to pretend that there were a bunch of other buyers, because there weren't. And then on KGS, KGS was a great business. We built it and it had we went from a piece of paper to a business that had $70 million of cash flow, over 200 employees with offices throughout the U.S. And we ultimately sold it to Bank of Montreal. We're sitting in their building. And again, we had one viable bidder. And in that case, our alternative was not to sell, right? So the point is so in one, we had an alternative to go public. And the alternative was that we would just keep bidding against this person and changing the dynamic. And with BMO, we just said, look, the thing's generating cash flow. We don't have to sell, even though internally we wanted to sell the business. And so I think the way in which in each of those cases, it wasn't a competitive auction, but I think we got full price because we created a alternative that was credible.
So now we're $1.5 billion later, at least across these three businesses. In the meantime, you decide to teach a class at the University of Toronto. Why would you go do something like that?
I talked about the fact that the single most important event in my family's life was coming to Canada. And so I always, even though we'd been very successful in New York and we built our life in New York, we'd now lived in the States for 15 years. We moved back to Canada, at least in part because I often thought, well, I want to do something. I want to raise my kids there and I want to do something for Canada. My parents were getting older. And so we moved back, and I guess this was in 2004. And I reconnected with some of my friends from high school and from McGill. And look, they're all great. But what I realized was that they were having far less impact. And I don't just mean making money. I just mean less impact than the folks that I'd met in Silicon Valley or on Wall Street or in Harvard. And it wasn't because they were less smart. And so I started thinking, well, why is it? Why is it that their lives seem to be, I'm not suggesting any less happy. I'm just saying they certainly seem less impactful. And it struck me that there was a core problem, and that core problem was one around expectations and exposure. So I went to McGill, and again, this is very different now, and I think Next and my class played a big role in this. I went to McGill, and I never met any leader other than a professor. Okay, there were no leaders who came, and whether it's entrepreneurs, politicians, whatever it may be. And so, whereas if you went to Harvard or Stanford at that time, you'd be inundated with these folks. And what these folks do is they provide you with through that exposure, you realize they're not that different from you, and they reset your expectations and what's possible. So you don't just think you can write a book, you think you might be able to win the Pulitzer Prize. You don't just think you want to be a vice president at Royal Bank, you think, okay, how do I create the next tech bank or whatever it may be. And so I think this combination of expectations and exposure was something that I was thinking about. And, the story is accurate. I was walking along St. George Street and I look up and there's Rotman and the business school. And I'd never been into Rotman before, but I decide to go. And I ask who the dean is, and it's this fellow named Roger Martin. And so I go up to see him, and he's not there. So I'm like, all right, that's too bad. So I come out of Rotman, and directly opposite Rotman is the Department of Economics. And so I cross the street, and I go to the dean's office, and there's an assistant there, but the dean's office door is open. And I just sort of push my way in, and the assistant, I remember, sort of freaking out. And the dean's name is Michael Berkowitz, and I introduced myself. And everyone's a little bit frazzled. And I said, listen, I want 10 minutes of your time, and I think it'll be worthwhile. And I think he wasn't threatened, I suppose. So he found it intriguing. And so he said, okay, sure. So the reason Next Canada exists is because of this meeting, frankly. So I talked to Michael, and I said, listen, I have this idea to teach a class. I want the best kids from U of T. It's going to be a very competitive class. It'll be different from any other class they take, but it's really going to be about resetting people's trajectories and what they might accomplish, okay? He said, well, you want to be a guest lecturer? I said, no, I don't want to be a guest lecturer. I want a fully accredited class where I am the professor teaching this class, and it's as important from a credit perspective as any other class. And he said, well, where are you living? And at this point in time, we were back in New York because we wanted to have our twins in New York. I said, I'll fly up on a weekly basis to teach the class. And then he said, well, have you taught before? And I said, no. He said, well, do you have your PhD? I said, no. He said, well, why would I let you teach a class? And I said, because it'll be the best class at U of T. And, he trusted me, and he said, okay, I'll do it. So the class from inception wasn't a fully accredited class, and it was a class that, many of the principles at Next Canada were started in that class where, it is true, if you took the class, you know this. If you were late, if you were unprepared, if your cell phone went off, you were kicked out of the class. It was also a class unlike any other at U of T where you had to apply to get into my class. And I chose whether you would get in or not, okay, which was apparently offside. I also never had office hours or interacted with faculty or anything like that.
You had like one office hour.
Maybe one office hour. But the point was my view was that I was actually treating people with much more respect than they initially might have thought. Because what I was saying was, you show up prepared, and I'll make sure that you have a great experience, okay? But if you don't show up prepared, I have no interest in you being in the class, because not only are you going to ruin the experience for me, but you're going to ruin the experience for everyone else. So creating a set of expectations where people had to come prepared, that in of itself made it really different from every other class. And so that anxiety, I think, was very helpful, because people came prepared, and then they were put in an environment that was very different than the rest of their classes. And there was a level of competition in that environment that I think was productive. But at the same time, I was harshest on the people I liked most. And I took the greatest pride in in sort of having the largest impact on people. So if I saw someone who was struggling or who didn't want to speak, I would do my best to make sure that I transformed their experience. When I came back to Canada, I did two things. One is I joined the board of Sick Kids and ultimately became the vice chair of Sick Kids, which was great, because I think Sick Kids, together with probably Toronto Film Festival, are the two most relevant charitable institutions in Canada. But it was a very high-level view, high-level seat. Whereas with Next, what I wanted was an ability to actually touch the lives of individuals and hopefully have optionality around helping create an ecosystem. And I didn't exactly know that the class was going to lead into Next when I started the class, but there was no anything like Next at that time. The class was a precursor to much of the things that happened. I taught that class for 6 years, for 2 semesters a year. So it became an important part of my life. And different from Next, I would invite the top 10 students to my house and then pick the person who'd win my award and who would work for me for a year. I had lots of trade-offs at that point in time. I was asked to, and came very close, signed a contract, and then ultimately backed out of it with CBC to become a dragon on Dragon's Den. And I just told the story about Kevin. When I decided not to do it, they said, well, do you have any ideas of who could do it? And I said, well, there's this really funny guy who I'm partners with, building a storage business, who I think could be great. And they said, who's that? I said, it's Kevin O'Leary. And they said, well, who's that? And so he's got me to thank for that. So my point is what I didn't want was a flippant, I wanted something substantive and where I could, with a few people, hopefully have a real impact. And then those few people hopefully would inspire many, many more over time.
And so what made you flip from, I'm just going to teach this class, teach it for the next 20 years, to build what is now a fully functioning organization?
Yeah. So I think, so a few things happened. So I'd say, first and foremost, this won't shock you when you look at my career, it's hard for me to stay focused on one thing for a very long period of time. And so I think I started getting restless with this class. I was starting to think about, okay, can I make this broader? And I was getting lots of requests from students from other universities who wanted to sit in on this class. And so I started thinking, well, maybe there could be a national program here. And at the same time, I thought I'd thought hard enough about the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And at the time, remember, there was no Mars, there was no CDL, there was no Velocity, there were none of these things. And so I thought, okay, I can be a leader in trying to inspire others to do something like this, okay? And I think that the key decision, and I give David Naylor, who was the president of University of Toronto, a lot of credit. David's really, I view him as a co-founder of Next, in that what I knew to be true was that I couldn't do this within U of T. The great thing about my class was I never had to interact with U of T. It was a great sort of totally hands-off where I could do my thing and didn't have to, join any unions or be part of any bureaucracy or anything like that. But I knew that if I was going to create something like this, it couldn't be part of U of T. And I give David a great amount of credit because David understood that. And he could have easily said to me, Reza, I'm not going to be supportive unless this falls under the U of T umbrella. I didn't want it to fall under the U of T umbrella because I wanted my own thing. I wanted the freedom. And so he gave me a green light and the support to go do something outside of U of T. And that was sort of the first most important thing that happened in the creation of Next. This is well before any conversations with Ajay or Claudia or Tim. Was in my mind, I was like, okay, if I'm going to create something national, I've got to make sure I have the support of the president of the University of Toronto, because he's going to credibly say to Gale and Weston and all these folks that Reza's class was far and away the most impactful class at U of T. It's different me saying it. It's another thing for the president of U of T saying it. I don't know if there is another entity like Next that is fully independent and not beholden to an institution. So it was a reasonably unusual thing to do, but I thought that it would give us the flexibility to have a broader impact. And there were certain things that I learned from my class that I wanted, which was that I wanted to be very competitive. I wanted to find right tail people who could then build things of real significance that would improve the lot of many more people. And so I started thinking about, well, who is that team? What does the team look like to execute on this vision? Because, of course, I'm also building businesses on the side here, and I've got 3 young kids. So just like in any typical entrepreneurial venture, you're thinking about, okay, what are the set of skills you need? And, it has to be people you trust and people that have complementary skills to you, but haven't, that have passion around what you're doing. So really, in order, Tim, who was at the time CEO of Goldman Sachs, was in my YPO forum. So he was very aware of my class. We had been in a forum for the prior 6-7 years. So he had seen the impact that the class was having on the students. And he, I think, knew my story very well. He bought into the whole Canada piece, which is how do we create more entrepreneurs and leaders and transform their trajectory within Canada. And what he provided me was he had institutional credibility. Okay, so whereas I was the entrepreneur, he was someone who, as CEO of Goldman, had lots of institutional credibility as I thought about fundraising for this new venture. And then I remember meeting with Roger Martin to tell him I was going to do this. Roger, at this point, was the dean of Rotman. And I think he was probably a little prickly because he would rather this have stayed at Rotman, but that wasn't happening. But he slipped up because I said, look, I need an academic director. And he said, this is music to my ears, and it's music. It should be music to any aspiring entrepreneur's ears. He said, well, I've got a great person, but you'll never get him. Okay? So just so you know, when I hear that, I've already got that guy or gal, okay? Meaning it's like game on. So all I cared about in that meeting was getting the name of this person. I just had to get the name of this person because then I get him. And so finally, after me working, trying to get at it in a non-obvious way, Roger said, well, yeah, it's Ajay Agarwal. He's on a great trajectory, but you know what? You'll never get him. So I reached out to Ajay and said, you don't know me, but taught this class. Here are the reviews of the class. Students would review classes anonymously. And I tell the story only because people think I'm just such a jerk. Okay, this is their time to get back at me. 6 years, 2 semesters, I was the top ranked professor at U of T every semester.
I'm pretty sure you had a perfect rating.
Yeah, so even for those people who I think had a very difficult experience with me, I think upon reflection, they said, wow, well, he actually did care and he did teach me more than I might have expected. So that, I think, was relevant to Ajay because at least I was coming at it as a so-called academic. And so I met with Ajay. And look, to his great credit, I talked about what I wanted to do and he was in. Like it was remarkable. He said, I'm in. And he's been an incredible partner throughout. And then the final piece was we needed someone to actually run it because I wasn't going to run it. I would share it, but I'm not going to run it. And this is a funny story. I get a call from a friend of mine, Claudia Hepburn. And Claudia had a set of experiences in education. She had built a couple of ventures in education. And so she had a very relevant background to Next. She asked me for lunch. So I said, sure, I'm happy to come for lunch. I walked her through what we were thinking about. And, over the next month or two, came to an agreement with her to become the executive director. So at that point, we had a team of 4 people who were committed to building this thing. And then we moved forward.
Mm-hmm. So now I think we're on part of the reason why we're having this conversation is we're 10 years into Next. And I'm curious, kind of looking back at those past 10 years, like what are some of the things that have exceeded your expectations as to what you thought you could accomplish?
Yeah.
And the second part being, what are the things that you think still need to be done and you're excited to see happen?
Right. So I think there's a few things that have exceeded expectations, both at Next, within Next and outside of Next. So outside of Next, what has exceeded my expectations is I think that Next has played a incredibly important, and I'd say the most critical role at helping create a much broader and deeper entrepreneurship ecosystem in Canada. Okay, so I think that because of Next, Creative Destruction Lab exists. Because of Next, DMZ exists. Because of Next, there are so many of these entities that learned from what we were doing, saw what we were doing, and created things that look and feel like Next. Okay, and I think that that's terrific for Next, but it's even more terrific for this country, right? So I think that I always wanted Next to play a leadership role in helping create the ecosystem. I think that we've done more than our fair share there. I think the second thing two other things that I would talk about in terms of exceeding expectations is that I think the quality of people that come through Next, I mean, again, I've now been teaching, so 2004, so what is that, 15 years, okay? I've done nothing in my life for anything close to 15 years, right? And so I think the bar for me each year is higher and higher to stay engaged and involved. And I think that ultimately the reason I spend so much time and energy on this program is because I really enjoy interacting with the folks that are coming through it. And now the alums, right? And so I think that the quality of our student base is high. It needs to stay high. And it's intriguing to me, okay? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a piece that's been important. The other thing that has, I think, outperformed is I don't think I fully appreciated how hard it is to create a charitable institution without an umbrella parent. There's a reason why, I don't know if there are any others, okay? And the reason is because you've actually got to, as opposed to other entities which ultimately can draw upon the larger institution for fundraising, for people, for leadership, for space, for all sorts of things, we had to actually create that from scratch, all within a charitable endeavor where initially, for at least 3 of the 4 of us, it's not even close to our full-time job. And what has surprised me is that was a difficult thing to do, and it continues to be difficult, right? We are 100% responsible for all our fundraising. We are 100% responsible for the people we hire. We are 100% responsible for the students that come through the program, and we had to create our own brand around it. We couldn't leverage University of Toronto or other things to do that. And so What I'd say, there's been some volatility, like in any entity, but I'd say what's outperformed is just the resilience of this brand and the people that care about it. Because we had to do this on our own and count on so many people to help us, we've created a very strong bond with a bunch of people who really care about our mission, because we haven't had the crutch of relying on an institution. We've had to actually build that from ground up ourselves. And so I think that's been a pleasant surprise, just the resiliency of the brand and the organization. But if I think about sort of the next set of years, I think if I'm very selfish, what I would say is what I hope, Jay and I talk about this, what we hope is that when we're in our 70s, we talk about like being in our Muskoka chairs, what we really want is to like look out and say, look, there are a bunch of people that are doing things of real significance, and they're doing them bigger, better, faster than they would have otherwise because of their experience at Next, okay? That we gave them a set of skills, a set of experiences that fundamentally changed the trajectory of their careers and of the kind of impact they were going to have. And so I don't measure it in months or years, I measure it in decades. And what I hope to see over the next set of decades is people doing extraordinary things, right? Really extraordinary things. And I'm not suggesting they're doing it solely because of Next. I'm suggesting they're doing it in part because what Next did was, at a critical point in their lives, was open the window around what was possible and gave them some tools to execute on that vision. And so I think that will, for me, be the definition of success. The other piece I would also say is that by definition is becoming more important is the alumni network, right? So you can imagine when we first started Next, there was no focus on the alumni network because we had none. But I'd say today and going forward, it is the most important part of Next, right? And so I want this organization to survive long past my involvement. And, I think that has everything to do with the alums. In fact, I remember talking to Joe Canavan when we pitched him on Next 10 years ago, and he immediately jumped in as a board member. And of course, he's now our CEO. And what he said at that time was that, and it's absolutely true, was that the real success of Next over time will be whether the alums support and embrace it, because that will mean that they thought it was of value. And so I am seeing some of that happening now, and certainly you're a great example of that. But my hope is that will continue and really accelerate over time.
Last couple of questions. Obviously, it's very clear to me and clear to you why you spend time in Next, why it's important to you, why Canada's important to you. But if I'm, an executive at one of the major banks or law firms, like, why should I care about what will be maybe, another 1,500 entrepreneurs coming out of this program? Why should that matter to me? Why should I support?
Right. So I think that there's two reasons why someone like that would support it. Number one, they should come spend a day at Next and see the impact we're having on these people. So I think it's a fundamental human desire to positively impact others. And so I think that whoever that person, that guy or gal is, what they will see is that we're having a fundamentally positive impact on these people, and their support is helpful to that. In terms of the bigger picture of why to do it is, and I can only speak to why I do it and why so many of my closest colleagues have become so involved in Next, because I think it also resonates for the fellow or the person that you're referring to in the abstract, which is Canada has a serious problem, right? Canada has a serious problem in that we cannot compete on cost or scale. We must compete on innovation, okay? We have to, all right? And our problem is that we are not creating enough value at the right tail, meaning we are not creating enough entrepreneurs who are creating businesses of extraordinary value. And you're starting to see it now with the Shopifys, but we need a Facebook to be built here. We need a Google to be built here. And so the only way I believe to do that is to start early. And frankly, maybe even earlier than Next does, but to identify those people who we think have real potential and provide them with a set of experiences such that they expand their expectations and that their trajectory is fundamentally reset. And so to the extent that you want to increase prosperity for all in Canada, which I suspect most people in those positions would care a lot about, I think what Next does is highly aligned with that goal. And so it is a long-term process, but it is one where we are hopefully inspiring Canada's next generation of entrepreneurs to think much bigger and to do things that are much bigger. And so I think we've got to invest in those people. And I think we've got a reasonably strong formula for how to go about doing it. And at the end of the day, we need the support of people like that because we're not part of a large organization, right? And so, and look, at the end of the day, I also think that, we've been talking about our most compelling proposition is actually for someone like that is to have them sit with some of our alums and let them tell the story. And so I think we now have that ability to do that.
Yeah, I think in closing, I just want to build on what you're saying. If I talk to my own personal experience, and I've told you this before, if I think about first from your class, which is a micro version of what Next is, like that had a massive impact on changing my expectations of what I wanted to do, where entering in university, the only thing I was exposed to that was interesting, difficult was like, I'll become a management consultant, because that was like the pinnacle of what the university showed me until I entered your class and I get to meet Saul Feldberg. I get to meet all these amazing entrepreneurs and leaders. And I'm like, wow, actually I can be that person. I didn't even think that was something I could even see. And so that immediately had an impact on changing my career path and went straight into, startups and trying to build things. And then now when I look back at, I think it's about 7 years or 8 years since I've been through Next 36 proper, all of my friends that I spend the most time with are not from high school, not from university. It's either a Next alum or someone I've met through that alumni network directly. And so pretty much my entire life is built on the foundation of your class and this program. So thank you for that.
No, you're welcome.
One last fun question to finish off. We started with hockey, and you said, one of your I guess bucket list items back then was learning how to skate, and you skated with Wayne Gretzky. Now, like what's left on your personal bucket list?
I think it's sort of a funny thing. What I learned as you get older is how much of an impact your childhood has on you, right? Despite the fact that you obviously learn lots of new things and you push yourself to do more, but fundamentally, a lot of who you are is shaped as a child. And so I talked about my immigrant experience, and one of the things that I missed most when I left Kenya to come to Canada, and probably the only thing that I really missed, was that we would always go on safari, right, to these game parks. And it's like the most wonderful thing ever. And we do it now with my family every year with my kids. And so this is totally, you asked for something that's on my bucket list. So on my bucket list is to create a conservation that is environmentally friendly, but still very protective of the animals that are there, and create something that's truly extraordinary in Kenya. And so it's something I'm thinking hard about, so that, but it's something I feel quite passionate about. Very different from anything I've done here, but it feels full circle.
Thank you for building everything you've created, and I look forward to many more interactions like this.
Terrific. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into LaunchPod. Check back in often to hear from bold entrepreneurs paving the way for a more prosperous and competitive Canada. To learn more about our 500 entrepreneurs and the work they're doing to put Canada on the global stage, please visit nextcanada.com.